The boat had always listed north. Not enough to matter, not enough to affect what it could carry or how it handled in rough water. A lean of perhaps 3 degrees, settled into Hull over 20 years of working the same channels and the same currents. The wood, having absorbed the river's pressure away, would absorb everything it lived
18
in
months of
long
data
enough.
show depths dropping
Desiree
consistently.
Fondneau's grandmother
Noted.
had noticed
Our model's
it
in
first.
this water for 28
Sometime
years.
in the 1950s, running the old wooden shrimping vessel in the channel south of New Orleans before the work moved her family to the Delta's western edge. She had mentioned it to her husband, who had said, "The boat knows which way the water pushes. Leave it." Nobody moved the boat when the grandmother stopped working. It sat on blocks behind a boathouse on the edge of the distributary, listing slightly north the way it always had. And eventually the grass grew up around the blocks, and the hull weathered gray and became part of the landscape the way old things did in the Delta, permanent in their impermanence, remembered without being thought about. Desiree was 57 years old. She had been running cargo lighters through this Delta for 28 years, moving supplies and equipment between the port and the offshore platforms and the island communities that dotted the outer reaches of the Louisiana coast. She had grown up with the old boat on the blocks and had never thought particularly hard about the list until the year the new deep water channel changed how the distributary moved. That was when the list started to mean something. Her great-grandmother's boat was a 1931-built wooden shrimping vessel, lap-strake-hulled, roughly 32 feet, repaired so many times across its working life that there was probably more replacement wood in it than original. The registration was still in the house somewhere, the original paperwork in her great-grandmother's name with a port stamp from 1931 that Desiree had always thought was beautiful in the way of all old official documents. The certainty of the typography, the assumption of its own permanence. It had worked the Delta's channels for over 2 decades before the family moved operations, and the boat was retired to blocks. Her grandmother had kept it because you didn't get rid of something that still floated, and because the Delta had a way of making you feel that things you stopped needing might become necessary again. Desiree had grown up in the shadow of it, literally. The boathouse sat on the south bank of the distributary channel. She had used all her working life, and the old boat was visible from the dock where she fueled her lighters and checked her cargo manifests. She had run her hand along the hull as a child. She had climbed into it as a teenager and sat in the bow looking at the channel. She had not, in 28 years of running her own operation, given the list much conscious thought. Her grandmother's explanation had always been sufficient. The boat knows which way the water pushes. She had filed this away as a piece of old woman wisdom that may or may not have been true, and that didn't require verification, because it was already interesting enough to keep. The Port Authority's Deep Water Channel project had been 3 years in the planning and approval process before Desiree had a chance to comment on it at a public meeting. The project was significant. A new approach channel, dredged to 45 feet, that would allow post-Panamax container ships to reach the port without relying on the existing shallower route that limited vessel size and require expensive scheduling around tidal windows. The economic justification was substantial. The environmental review had taken the better part of 2 years. Desiree had read what she could of the reviewed documents, which was more than most people in the room at the stakeholder meeting would read. She had engineering training from a 2-year technical program she completed in her 30s, and while she was not a hydrologist, she understood enough about how water moved to know that a deep channel cut through a delta didn't just affect the area it replaced. It affected how water moved through everything connected to it. She had been noticing for 2 seasons that the distributary channel she used for the island community runs felt different. Not dramatically, not in a way she could have pointed to on a chart, but different in the specific way that 28 years of daily familiarity made itself available. A slight reduction in what she could only describe as the water's urgency in the secondary channel. The current that always had particular assertiveness at certain tide stages now running a little more gently, and the depth at her usual turning point near the third island community seeming by feel to be decreasing. She had initially told herself this was the normal fluctuation of a dynamic delta system. She had spent a full season not trusting what she was noticing, because a season of not trusting was a right response to an observation that could have been confirmation bias. That could have been her attending more carefully to a thing she was already nervous about. She had run these routes for 28 years. She knew what confirmation bias felt like from the inside. She had been taking depth soundings at that turning point for 18 months. The soundings confirmed what she felt. 8 inches of shoaling over a year and a half. 8 inches was not catastrophic, but 8 inches in a shallow draft route used by small supply vessels was not nothing. She raised it at the stakeholder meeting in the most precise terms she could manage without instruments she didn't have. She described the secondary channel's change current behavior over 2 seasons. She described the depth soundings. She said she believed the deep water channel was capturing a disproportionate share of the delta's total flow, starving the secondary distributary of the sediment transport capacity it needed to counteract natural subsidence, and that the shoaling she was measuring was an early indicator of what that meant for the smaller communities her route served. The Port Authority's hydrological engineer, a careful man named Dr. Esteve, listened carefully. He said the project's flow modeling showed acceptable distribution across the delta's distributaries. He said minor variation in secondary channel behavior was expected in any dynamic delta system, particularly in the years immediately following a major channel modification, and that the modeling projected equilibrium within 3 to 5 years as the system adjusted. He said 8 inches of shoaling over 18 months was within the range of natural variability documented in the project's baseline sediment transport data. Desiree asked what the baseline data's time range was. Dr. Esteve said the sediment transport baseline covered 5 years prior to the project's groundbreaking. Desiree said she had 28 years on this water, and the channel had not behaved this way before the deep water project. Dr. Esteve said 28 years of operator experience was valuable local knowledge and would be noted in the project record. He said the modeling suggested the system would stabilize. Desiree drove home along the distributary road with a particular feeling of a person who has been heard correctly and listened to incorrectly, which was different from being ignored and somehow harder. Dr. Esteve had repeated her observations back to her accurately. He had engaged with the data she presented. He had explained, in terms she could follow, why the modeling suggested her observations were within expected variation. He had not dismissed her. He had simply been confident in instruments that covered a shorter period than her experience did, and she had no way of making 28 years of daily familiarity into a number it could enter into a model. She had been wrong about one thing, and she knew it. The initial 8 inches of shoaling she'd measured, she had attributed it, in the first season, to dredged spoil migration from the deep water project's disposal operations. The spoil had been placed at a designated offshore site, but she knew from years in the delta that disposed sediment moved, and she had spent the first season building a case around the spoil migration theory and taking soundings at multiple points to track what she assumed was a moving sediment front. By the end of that season, the soundings showed that the shoaling wasn't moving. It was occurring at the same locations across all her measurement points simultaneously, which was not how migrated spoil behaved. Migrated spoil would show a front, elevated depths in one area, normal depths elsewhere. What she was seeing was uniform shoaling across the entire secondary channel reach, consistent with reduced sediment transport from the upstream source rather than deposition from external source. She had spent 4 months on the wrong theory before the pattern of the soundings forced her to abandon it. She was not angry at herself for this. She had been working with limited instruments and a plausible mechanism, and the soundings were what they were. She had followed a real possibility until the data told her to stop. That was the correct process. But she was aware that the 4 months had cost her, and that the correct theory was less intuitive and harder to demonstrate than the spoil migration story would have been. Migrated spoil was visible and localizable. Reduced sediment transport from an upstream flow capture was a systemic change that expressed itself in distributed shoaling across a channel reach, which looked, from the water, like nothing in particular until you had enough soundings to see the pattern. She went back to her soundings and started building the actual case from the data she had. The delta's behavior over the following 2 years confirmed what she had documented and did not resolve it. The secondary distributary continued to lose average depth across her measurement stations. The rate was slow enough that the island community vessels could still complete their runs, though with reduced cargo loads at certain tide stages that had previously been fully navigable. The outer island community, the most dependent on the route, had twice in the second year received delayed supply deliveries because the tide window for safe passage had narrowed. An event that would have been manageable with normal channel depth had, twice, become a supply disruption. She had notified the Port Authority both times, and both times a response had been a note in the monitoring log. The monitoring log was accurate. The monitoring log did not solve the problem of a community that ran low on medical supplies because the tide window had narrowed. She kept taking soundings. She kept her logs. She submitted the data to the Port Authority's post-construction monitoring program, which received it and logged it under community-reported observations. Then, in the third year, a coastal geologist named Dr. Arnaud, who was studying delta morphology in the region, contacted her after reviewing the monitoring program's community observation files. He had seen her sounding data. He wanted to come out to the secondary channel and talk to her about what she was observing. He came on a gray November morning and spent the day in her lighter, running her island community routes, watching the water and asking questions. He was a careful man, more interested in listening than in telling, and she showed him the secondary channel in all its stages across the tide cycle. The way the current ran at flood, the way it ran at ebb, the way the depth at the turning point varied with the tide stage in ways she had learned to read for cargo scheduling. At the end of the day, back at the dock, he asked about the boat on the blocks. She had pointed out on the way in, almost by reflex. It was always there in her peripheral vision from the dock, part of the geometry of the boathouse corner. He had noticed it, and now he was asking. She told him what she knew. The 1931 hull, her great-grandmother's shrimping boat, the permanent list. He asked if he could look at it. They walked behind the boathouse. He circled the hull, looking at the list from different angles, and then crouched at the waterside of the vessel and examined the lower strakes, where the hull had been in contact with the water for years before being dry docked. The weathered wood of the lower hull's northern face showed where patterns consistent with sustained lateral pressure. He asked what her grandmother had said about the list. Desiree said, "She said the boat knows which way the water pushes." He photographed the wear patterns before he stood up, systematic photographs from the same angle at each cross-section, the kind of documentation that turned an old boat on blocks into something that could be cited in a technical report. Desiree watched him work with the same feeling she had watching him run the routes, that here was someone who arrived with enough curiosity to find the thing he was looking for, rather than enough method to find the thing his method could measure. Dr. Arnaud stood up. He looked at the distributary. He said, "This channel has a dominant lateral current component during the mid-flood tidal stage, a consistent north-directed flow that would have exerted exactly the pressure on a moored vessel that produced this list over years of exposure. That lateral component is a function of how this distributary interacts with the primary channel at the upstream junction. If the deep water channel has captured enough of the primary channel's flow, that lateral component will have changed, reduced, or redirected, and your secondary channel's reduced sediment transport capacity, which is what your soundings show, would be a direct consequence of that change in the junction dynamics." Desiree was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The boat's list is a record of what the current used to do here." Dr. Arnaud said, "Yes, if we could measure the lateral force that produced this list over 20 years, we could characterize the pre-project current regime in this channel to a level of precision that no pre-project survey captured. The baseline data your authority is using to evaluate the secondary channel's behavior doesn't include this kind of lateral current characterization because nobody knew to measure it." He asked if she had any documentation of when the list had developed, or how long the boat had been moored in the channel before being dry docked. She said, "My grandmother's records might have the mooring dates. They're in the house." The records were an old recipe book that her grandmother had also used for boat maintenance notes, a pencil-written calendar from 1947 to 1953 that tracked tides and maintenance schedules, and the 1931 vessel registration that gave the build date and original specifications. From those three documents, Dr. Arnaud and Desiree were able to establish with reasonable confidence that the boat had developed its list during a mooring period between approximately 1942 and 1961, a period of nearly 20 years during which it had sat at the same dock in the same orientation, subject to the same tidal cycle. Dr. Arnaud spent a full day with the boat, making measurements, the degree of list at multiple hull cross-sections, the wear pattern on the lower strakes, the orientation relative to the channel. He compared his measurements against historical current data from the Army Corps of Engineers pre-project surveys and found what he was looking for. The boat's list was consistent with the north lateral current component that the Corps surveys had recorded at this distributary junction, a component that had not been included in the Port Authority's project baseline because it was not considered relevant to the project's primary current velocity modeling. The lateral current had always been there. It had simply been considered a secondary feature not worth capturing in the baseline. The boat's hull had captured it anyway. Dr. Arnault's findings went to the Port Authority and, separately, to the Army Corps of Engineers as part of an ongoing coastal subsidence assessment for the region. The report's treatment of the boat was careful and precise. It described the vessel as a historical hydrological instrument, a term that made Desiree laugh once and then stop laughing, because it was exactly right. The hull had been an instrument. It had been recording continuously on the blocks, in the sun and rain, for 30 years. Nobody had been reading it because nobody had known it was measuring. His report documented the secondary distributary's reduced sediment transport capacity, its relationship to the deep water channel's flow capture, and the risk of continued shoaling in the island community routes. It also described what he called an unusual historical current record, the hull deformation of a 1931 wooden vessel moored in the secondary distributary for approximately 20 years, which provided the only available characterization of the pre-project lateral current regime at the distributary junction. The Port Authority commissioned additional hydrological modeling based on Dr. Arnault's findings. The modeling confirmed that the deep water channel had reduced the lateral current component in the secondary distributary by approximately 30%, a change sufficient to measurably reduce the distributary sediment transport efficiency and explain the shoaling Desiree had been documenting. The remediation was a series of modified sill structures installed at the upstream distributary junction, designed to partially restore the flow split that had historically maintained the secondary channel's transport capacity. The sills were a compromise between restoring the pre-project flow balance and maintaining the deep water channel's navigability for the large vessels the project had been designed to serve. The shoaling in the secondary channel slowed significantly after the sills went in. The island community routes returned to full navigability at all normal tide stages within 2 seasons. Desiree was at the dock on a clear January morning when the first full supply run to the outer island community completed on the old schedule. All cargo, no reduced load. The tide window back to what had been before any of this started. She came back to the dock in the early afternoon and stood for a while looking at the old boat on the blocks. The list was still there. Of course it was still there. The hull's memory of 20 years of current pressure wasn't a change because the current had changed. The boat had recorded what the water had been. It didn't know what the water was now. Her grandmother had said, "The boat knows which way the water pushes." She had been right, in the specific way that people were right when they made observations precise enough to be useful, without knowing why they were precise. The boat had known. It had been knowing on the blocks through all the years of Desiree's working life, storing a measurement nobody had thought to take. She thought about going in for coffee and then didn't. She stayed at the dock a little longer. The distributary ran the way it was supposed to run again, not perfectly, not as it had run before the Deepwater project, but within range. The sills weren't the original junction, but they were close enough that the water had found something it could use, and the secondary channel was moving sediment the way it needed to move it, and the islands were getting their supplies on time. She put her hand on the old hull the way she had as a child. The wood was dry and gray and cold in the January air. The list was still 3 degrees north, the same as it had always been, patient and unrevised, and exactly as useful as the moment she had finally known how to read it.